Alright, so admittedly this might seem like a bit of an odd choice to put Great Expectations with Oliver, given that there's probably a much more appropriate David Lean movie from the 40s, also starring Alec Guinness, that might go better with Oliver. But after we did My Fair Lady and Pygmalion last week, I kind of figured it'd be a bit boring to continue the trend of do one and then basically do the other that tells the exact same story thing. So I figured we would mix it up just a little bit and do the basically take a look at like two vastly different ways that like view and celebrate Dickens, looking at his two most popular stories about orphans. So we have the sort of classic telling and the non-musical black and white movie with the big colorful musical, and how both these more or less put his style in these great big screen adaptations, regardless of how different they actually are. So we're actually gonna obviously start with Oliver because that's the theme, but I actually was very familiar with the story for two reasons before I ever came across this movie. And that is, one, not only because Oliver and Company exists, which I think most of us probably saw at a very young age, but also Oliver Twist was the school play we did when I was in 5th grade, that we did with the 6th graders. I of course opted out of trying out of it and just stayed in the chorus, but still became very, very familiar with the story, despite the fact that obviously being a school play, it was a much more condensed version. Still, most of the points were in it. So one of the first things you want to point out, obviously, is it's something that probably could be said for both Oliver and Pip, and that is that there seems to be sort of thing that Dickens does here in both these stories where the main character isn't exactly the most interesting, and both those characters kind of exist to just have the events of the story happen around them, and the supporting characters having a lot more to do and being more memorable, basically. But the way, we'll go into that with Pip also, but in regards to the way Oliver is portrayed in this particular movie, I do like that they do kind of establish him pretty early. There is a lot of movie where he's just kind of sitting back and watching the musical numbers happen, and being dragged around by Sykes, but towards the start here, like in the first 20 minutes to half an hour or so, they do establish him quite nicely, not just with the crucial scene of him asking Mr. Bumble for more gruel, but also like when he's taken to the Undertaker's place, and we actually see him stand up for his dead mother that he never met. In this way, where at first it's enough that he just kind of says, you know, like, you leave her out of this, but then he goes as far as to basically beat the shit out of Noah Claypole for pushing that even further. And it really does kind of give him this sort of, you know, quality that's for a reliable protagonist to really have, to where he like really stands his ground, and he really has that whole, he'll stand up for the people that basically made him without ever having actually met them. And there is definitely something to that. Like there's like an honor to him in the way that he defends his mother. So not to mention, I just kind of like this scene in general, with the whole idea of him basically, his first real shelter after the orphanage is like a funeral parlor, which kind of really foreshadows the dark places this story is going to end up going, and that it may or may not end up in a couple of deaths. So, but yeah, but then, but the thing is, though, also, is that once that's established, it establishes him enough, I think, to get through the rest of the story, even though we still have like 2 hours of movie left at this point. But yeah, but it does feel a bit like, it seems to really come through the most in the very last scene of the movie. Because you'll notice that it almost seems like they kind of intentionally played this way to show just how much more impact the supporting characters had than Oliver, which is this shot where Fagin and the Artful Dodger kind of have their last scene where they go down the street, and it's this really great shot. And it feels so much like the final scene, but then it fades out, and then it's like, oh yeah, Oliver's the main character, and we have this one small epilogue left where he's taken back. And then it right there where it feels like the Fagin scene was like this big triumphant final scene. Just that one more last like 20 seconds of Oliver being taken back suddenly makes the ending feel really anticlimactic when the credits just roll right after it. So it almost feels like even the movie kind of threw him away a little bit. So I do get that criticism, which I've heard thrown at it a few times, but I still like enough that they established him towards the beginning in that way that they did. So there is that. And as far as the movie itself, I think the thing that's like just really the real attraction to it is how it's so incredibly just energetic and lively almost through like the entire thing. There are obviously musicals are always going to have like those one or two sad songs, no matter how upbeat and energetic they are. Whereas obviously, Where Is Love is basically like the cheer up Charlie of Oliver. And then there is Nancy's song, As Long As He Needs Me, which fits much more into the story and actually really works for her character. Whereas Where Is Love, in my personal opinion, does feel more like just the token sad song at the beginning. But it does. But I guess you could say that also adds a bit more to his character to really show the sadness and where he is and all that. But yeah, but it's probably the least memorable song in the movie, in a movie filled to the brim with songs that are instantly recognizable. Um, and one of my particular favorite numbers in here, to just single one out, is one that's not it's not one of those songs that you necessarily instantly remember, like Consider Yourself or something like that. But it's Who Will Buy, and not only is this like probably one of the most extravagant numbers in any musical ever, but it's also the very strategic placement of it to where it's the very first thing that happens right after it comes back from the intermission, which is absolutely perfect. But this scene where you have it for a while, it's just a scene about selling things. So we have like a vendor here and a vendor here, just like on the corners of the road, just asking if you'll buy stuff like strawberries. Uh, but it also has like this really optimistic yet also somehow melancholy tone to it that's just really nice. But then as it goes on, like more and more people kind of come out and kind of do this same thing, and then it just like builds with each new person. And then it's like for instance, when you look at Consider Yourself, that it also kind of did the same thing where it kind of built and built, and then there's just suddenly like hundreds of extras everywhere. But the way this one does it, where it starts off with this whole it's almost I sometimes forget that they're not like two different songs. Because the first one is so like nice and calm, and then as it builds, it turns into, like I said, something like the way like when the whole town got involved with Consider Yourself. They basically do that again, only it feels even bigger somehow. And then there's even those shots like the way they use different backgrounds, like the way the contrast is with we have like just the buildings and like the concrete, but then over here we have like the children and like the yellow outfits, and then like the green grass and the fountains, and then it like pans back and forth between the two. So it makes it feel like it's almost two totally different worlds, but it's still like this one gigantic big number. And so that's always like really stood out to me. Like I said, even if it's not one of the more memorable songs, like one of the more recognizable that you've probably heard many times over time in other places, I think that number is probably maybe the most standout one in the movie to me anyway. Like I said, that placement after the intermission could not have been more perfect. So there is that. And to talk about the choreography also, where we have like we'll use Consider Yourself for instance. There's one particular moment that feel like you think of choreography, you think of like the really big stuff and the whole everybody being synchronized and all that. But there's also some of those things where like you just have like these little inspired moments of timing, like when they're walking through like where the butchers are, and Dodger's like walking up, and just as he reaches the pig that's split in half, the butcher goes completely down, and Dodger's able to just walk through it just at the right time. Just stuff like that really matters, and really adds up when you look at like most of the more big things that people are obviously easier drawn to, that are much more in your face about it. Just little things like that are really nice. And then there is, like I said, just the overhead shot where it's like these sets kind of feel like they feel really enormous, but also like confined at the same time, like clearly sets. But then there's this last shot where this number has started with just Dodger singing and taking Oliver along with him, and then somehow ends with like what feels like everybody in London down this one road, where it just seems like this endless stretch of extras for the finale of this number, and it's insane. And it did actually end up winning an honorary Oscar for its choreography. Like this, the cover of this says winner of 6 Academy Awards. That's technically 5. I do, as far as competitive ones go. But yeah, the honorary Oscar for choreography does make it 6. So there is that. I guess it's kind of nice they wanted to make sure to flaunt that. So, and then yeah, and I'm talking about with the sets. It is just like I said, they feel so massive yet so contained at the same time. Kind of like what I was talking about with West Side Story, where we got like the one establishing shot of New York at the very beginning, and then the rest of it was just the sets that felt very small in comparison. This one's able to somehow do both those things simultaneously, which is kind of crazy, because we have like when he gets when he the very first time he gets to London, and we get that one shot. This probably has a lot to do with the score too. How we can see the whole thing just in this one frame, but at the same time it just feels so incredibly big the first time we see it. And it's just this big introductory shot that really just sets the scene for pretty much the rest of the entire movie. And you can totally believe that like everything we're gonna see from now on is within this. So that's yeah. And then there's if there's one thing that like musicals be sure they really have down just as much as their choreography, it's their production design. You'll notice as you look at a lot of these, and this one is definitely a prime example of that. So. But that's also not it, just that shot. But there's also like you also kind of get that vibe when we get to go through like when the first time Fagin goes to see Sykes, and he like goes, we kind of follow him the whole time, sort of unbroken, and he goes like down one way and then like across this area where there's water, and then in this area that he doesn't quite go into, but we can still see how big it looks inside there, and you can just see the detail in all this, and it's really incredible. So, speaking of all these people, as far as the characters that surround Oliver go, there is Fagin, who is played by Ron Moody, who did score a Best Actor nomination despite being a pretty supporting character. He didn't even show up till like about 45 minutes in, but he made such an impact that he did manage to get a leading actor nomination. And yeah, what he does here is fantastic, not just because he's playing a guy that seems to be significantly older than he actually is. I think he was in like his early 40s or something. And Fagin comes off as like this decrepit old guy, and he somehow sells that perfectly. And the way he kind of builds up like he's this expert criminal that has these children, and you immediately think just with that setup like, this is a character that's totally shady. And the way he's kind of like, you know, brought them up to basically be master thieves, more or less, and to more or less benefit him. There should be a lot of reasons we don't like him, yet he's able to, and this is, obviously this comes in the writing too, but Moody's performance also just really, really sells this. How likable he is, and like how far that goes through the whole thing. Like there's that one moment that really stands out when they've kind of done like a practice run to show Oliver what they do in regards to pickpocketing, and he says, "All right, put all the stuff back in the box." And there's the one kid that doesn't put like the pocket watch back, and when he catches him, it's like he's gonna scold him like in a huge way, and he like congratulates him for basically being like a natural thief because he would hold on to it after being told to put it back. And even like I said, even when he's being a horrible influence by training these kids to steal from people, there's still something just so incredibly likable about the way that he does it and the way this character is written and portrayed. That just really makes it work. And then you have this moment, this big moment between him and Oliver, where in this same scene, where you have established the kind of character that he is, and he goes and he puts, like, Oliver just says, "Where do I sleep?" And you expect maybe he'll just say, "I'll just pick a spot, but he takes him to a specific place and like practically tucks him in, and then like sits down like a father figure would and says like, you have the potential to be the greatest man of all time. And it's like this really sincere moment that really makes him something like way beyond what we thought he was on the first impression. And that's, yeah, so I just really love the way that was pulled off. And then, of course, obviously, we have Jack Wilde, who managed to, despite his very young age, scored a supporting actor nomination. And yeah, there's not much else to say apart from the fact that he pretty much takes full command of this role that pretty much any child actor probably would have killed for. Like, if there's, you think of all the different roles that, like, adult actors want, like all the Shakespeare roles or anything like that, I would think one of the, like, ultimate roles for a child would be, like the Artful Dodger for child actors is basically like Hamlet for adult actors. Like, that's the one part you, like, fantasize about having. Like I said, he just really takes control of it and owns this part for sure, and kind of sort of becomes the face of it when you hear about the character down the way. Not just a dog voiced by Billy Joel, but yeah. So and then of course we have Bill Sikes, our villain, and he is a character that you know he's going to be a big deal starting because he's built up. He's built up in the Pick a Pocket or Two number, where they kind of talk about how he's like this. What they're basically aspiring to be is a thief of his stature. But we learn pretty quickly that there is more to sort of the danger that he brings on. He's this character that is very. He's able to make all the good characters kind of crumble under his control. Like, they're like, whether it be Fagin or Nancy, like he will take these characters that ultimately are good and have good intentions, but they make some like horrible, terrible decisions and do horrible, regrettable things because they're under his power. And this power really comes forth in his introductory scene, where Carol Reed gets to use shadows to his advantage again, much like he did in The Third Man with Orson Welles' introduction. But yeah, this first shot of him where we see his dog standing next to his shadow, and his dog might as well be just part of this character at this point. Like just a continuation of the character and not necessarily just a dog. But then when he comes out and he stands next to Fagin, he appears so menacingly and looks huge. Like, I had to look it up. Apparently Oliver Reed was like 5'11", which is my height. But when he's standing like next to Fagin or whatever, when we see him from a distance, he looks like enormous. Like, really, really intimidating. And then he'll, say stuff like, have you ever heard the sound the chicken makes as they're wringing off its neck? And something like that. And just have, like, this whole sort of psychosis inside him that, at first, we seem kind of like, maybe he's intimidating, but also maybe he's just one of them. There is that one moment after his introduction, after we've seen how big and scary he looks, where he's showing Fagin what all he stole while he was gone. And it's like this comedic moment where it's just like he's just endlessly pulling things out. It's almost like a sketch comedy bit or something from this big intimidating villain in his introductory scene. And then, as the scene where they like peek behind the flowers too. It's just like he's one of them for a while. But then there is a natural progression that shows off just how fucking crazy he actually is and how threatening he is and what it is he's capable of. When we did the play in 5th grade, these weren't the songs that we did. They were all totally different songs. And there's one song that we did that I really kind of wish was in this movie. And there was an entire song. Like, I talked about that Bill Sikes is mentioned in Pick a Pocket or Two, but in our play, there was an entire song devoted to building up Bill Sikes. And basically, like, the whole theme of the song was to not say his name, like he's Voldemort. So I kind of really wish that was in here, so I don't know where the hell the songbook from that play came from. I don't know if that's, like, just its own individual thing that exists. But, I mean, it would have to be, but yeah. But yeah, I do kind of wish there had been something a bit more like that, but I mean, at 2.5 hours, I suppose they did as much as they could without going over. So, but they still had to do like the roadshow format and all that. So it does kind of like you can feel yourself stretching it out sometimes, but for the most part, it's yeah. Oh, one more character I did want to touch on was Nancy, who I did mention in passing. But to kind of go into her, she is definitely like she seems like in another story she'd definitely be this easily throwaway character. That's just kind of there to be like the emotional support or whatever. But there is something like I don't know if it's just because we know her fate or what, but there is just kind of something that feels inherently tragic about her. I think it also has a lot to do with the fact that I think it's very easy to sort of relate her, not just her as a character, but her relationship with Oliver, to that of Mrs. Lovett's relationship with the kid in Sweeney Todd is reminding me a lot of, I'm not quite sure which one came first, but yeah, that's kind of how I always sort of saw that relationship, and that's what it reminds me a lot of. And there's even like the "As Long as He Needs Me" number. There's like a very similar number that Mrs. Lovett performs towards that kid. So, or no, the kid performs it to her, but it's the same sort of feel. So yeah, and then that's pretty much where you can see that the characters. You have a lot more to say about the supporting characters than you do Oliver himself, but yeah. So really, where the movie just really comes forward and sort of goes above and beyond is that it's one of those movies that feels like it's for everyone. Like it doesn't really have a particular demographic to it, despite being a musical, which you would kind of associate with like one or two different demographics, but it really does have this really sort of wide appeal with just how much it's going on with it and how much it juggles and all that. Because you do have this, it's this sort of it like the constant motion and like the really energetic characters. You could see like entertaining children quite easily, like sort of like the way the Wizard of Oz would, and how the songs are pretty much constant and all that. And then like movie lovers and that kind of sort can take it for like the technical aspects and all that, and the way that its tones can be like really light but then also really dark. And mainly the main thing it really seems to accomplish here is it's like when you really watch it, like it's one of those things that you don't really notice right away until you're kind of thinking about it afterwards, and that's the fact that yeah, once we leave the orphanage, like Mr. Bumble kind of negates this, the way he treats Oliver and the orphans, but once Oliver is in London and in this world, it's like the children in the story and the adults in the story are like on the same level practically, and so I think that's really important with kind of engaging like just a whole wide mass audience, and that's something you don't typically see. So that's something that's always really stood out about this movie, and of course, I just mentioned him in passing and mentioned The Third Man in passing once, but yeah, this movie was made by Carol Reed, winning his only Best Director Oscar for it as well. And the thing about it is he made like obviously like The Third Man, obviously, but then he made like Odd Man Out with James Mason. There was The Fallen Idol where Ralph Richardson was the butler and all that. And he has this really sort of and it's more so with people who are like really really into movies and not just more of like a casual moviegoer, but he really does have a legendary status, with just I mean The Third Man really would have done that alone, but with stuff like Odd Man Out and The Fallen Idol and stuff like that, this really kind of seemed like it's I mean, yeah, there are those notions where, like I said, like he uses shadow similarly to the way he does in The Third Man, but really, it's not something you immediately jump to when you hear that name, despite the fact that he won his Best Director Oscar for it. And but there's also, I mean, there is also that argument that he ended up, despite a sort of legendary status among the more, passionate moviegoers, there is the fact that when he won the Best Director Oscar, he beat Kubrick for 2001, because this was 1968. And there's that, age-old, predictable thing where people are going to go, oh my god, I can't believe Oliver, of all things, will win Best Director over 2001. 2001 was never going to win, because, number one, people don't seem to remember that 2001 was really controversial when it came out. And there was like a lot of people in the industry that really did not like it. Just look up Rock Hudson's reaction to it. And there's also the fact that it was like, but I mean, on top of that, also it was there was no, on top of that, there was also no, it didn't score a Best Picture nomination also, so it was never going to win Best Director regardless. But also, there was just this, I was talking about this with Kramer vs. Kramer and Apocalypse Now. It really comes down to the way it was at the time, and when a movie is, like, even somewhat controversial, the fact that Kubrick got nominated for 2001 is a miracle in itself, for how divisive that got. And the fact that you look at Oliver and you see, like I was talking about, just how wide and mass appeal it is. Really, if you just look into it, there's no real question about it. I know it's. I know if you just say it just on the surface, it seems crazy. But if you really look into it, there is logical sense to be made there. So that is why Carol Reed's only Oscar win was for a musical based on Oliver Twist, and not something like The Third Man or Odd Man Out or something. So, and how he managed to beat Kubrick for 2001. So, there's that for you. And so, yeah, as I mentioned, it did win 5, technically 6. It won Picture, Director, Production Design, Score, and Sound, and then the honorary one for Choreography. All the ones you would expect it to. So, and like I said, it got another slew of nominations, including Actor and Supporting Actor for Ron Moody and Jack Wild. So, yeah, so that's what that is. That's pretty much all I need to say about that one. And now we move on to Great Expectations, which is, once again, you look at the way we looked at Carol Reed, and you see, like, you see the way his filmography was, and then you see Oliver, and how it doesn't sort of seem like they go together or come from the same place, except with these, like, little moments. Obviously, there was definitely a David Lean period pre his big, massive epics. And I think his massive epics like Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago, Bridge on the River Kwai, A Passage to India, stuff like that, is more so nowadays what his name is associated with. But I mean, he really was doing some really great stuff before that, and this is like sort of the pinnacle of that. So the thing here is that really just when you look at it right off, because it just starts right away. There's like hardly any build up. There is no messing around with this movie. It just goes right the hell into it. And what I really want to point out here is the fact that this might seem a bit like hyperbolic, but not really. The thing about it, the way I've always seen Great Expectations, this version, is that everything in the movie, from about the very, very start to about maybe the 40 to 45 minute mark, like everything before Pip is an adult in this movie is some of the best stuff any movie has ever done in history. to just put it as flat as possible. Because we did have, like, when you look at Dickens adaptations, before this there had been, like, I think 1935 there was a version of David Copperfield, 1936 there was a version of A Tale of Two Cities, and both of those got Best Picture nominations for those years, but they weren't really that memorable, despite how legendary Dickens' status is and how beloved his works are. So this was kind of the ultimate achievement in putting Dickens on the screen. Of course, we've seen A Christmas Carol put on screen, like, every other year since forever. And there's not really one, one that everybody goes to. So I suppose the one from the 50s probably, but still, there was never a bigger, more absolute adaptation of Dickens than what David Lean did with Great Expectations. And it's, like, not even close. Like, there's, like, you would think there'd be, like, but there's also this, and there's also this, and they're kind of on par. It's like a landslide here, which is kind of crazy when you think of all the things you can do with this. But what he was able to do here, with the help of Guy Green, his cinematographer, just endless credit there, but there's, like, this opening scene in itself, okay? Where we have, like, this whole atmospheric thing where we have, like, the shot where it pans over everything, and we have, like, the fog, and then we have the cemetery and all that. These are things to where it's, like, it's something literary brought to life in a way that's almost indescribable. Where it's, like, these are the kind of things where you'd only expect to sort of see this in your imagination. Like, this is the kind of thing where, like, let's say Great Expectations was, like, a recent book, And this was going to be the very first adaptation. And so you read it, and these are the kinds of images you would get in your head. And then when you see them on screen, that's why people often say, that's why the phrase is so popular, the book was better. This is because when you see it, if you were to see the very first ever adaptation of Great Expectations today, this is what would be in your head, and what would be on the screen would be disappointing because it didn't look like this. It's almost like they extracted everything you could possibly, every single little detail that brings that story to life, and were somehow able to put it on the screen in a way that really hasn't been replicated when it comes to adaptation. And it's... you would... Oh, there's even these little things you would expect to suffer on the screen in some way. This movie is able to bring to life in a way that you probably never could have suspected if you, like I said, read the start of this and had read this. You didn't know the existence of this story, then you read the book, then you saw this, and it would just be this. It would be this mind-blowing thing. And it really brings about that lean scope also in that opening shot. Because I was talking about how the sets in Oliver feel very sort of contained. Great Expectations, you can feel like everything in regards to setting and where we are and all that. Like when we see this, and it's just really great. Like it's all kind of in the editing too. Like the opening shot I was talking about, where it's like we go across and we see this location shot of like this really vast land, and then like the next shot is the cemetery and sort of like the same feel, but it's like, to my understanding, the land shot, the big shot as it goes across, was a location shot. The cemetery is just a set, like a studio set. But you would never know that. Not just with how convincingly it's shot, but also the way it's put together, too, and the editing process just makes it seamless. And it's really... it's just really incredible stuff. And the weirdest thing about this, the most admirable thing, but also just the weirdest, and the biggest thing you can take away from this, is the fact that David Lean wasn't even like a Dickens fan. Like, he hadn't read Great Expectations when he went into this, and I think he said the only thing he'd been familiar with was A Christmas Carol, which everybody's familiar with. So it's like, that in itself is just insane, that it would take somebody that's such an outsider to material like this and was able to put it on screen in a way that, like I said, we would probably never see adaptations anytime soon. Just so thorough and vivid and just true to where the story was originally coming from. And it's, yeah, like I said, I mean, I'm doing my best, but like I said, really in the long run, it's almost sort of impossible to describe. Just like, there's just such a feeling with the first 40 minutes or so of this movie. And this isn't gonna like lead up to me saying in the other hour shit. This is just such a pinnacle of movie making, this first 40 minutes or so, that I can't get away from it. Like, it's all I want to talk about when I talk about this movie. So, I mean, we could go on also. It's like, I was talking about how Pip is similar to Oliver in the fact that it seems more like the story and the characters surround him as opposed to him being the story. And there is something there too, but it is like, there's even these moments that like could have potentially been ridiculous. But it's sort of like the way like the guilt is eating up at him when he steals food and the file to help out Magwitch in the cemetery. So he's like, the guilt is overcoming him and he's hearing the voices in his head, and then like the cow talks to him and says like, "Hello, young thief." And it's like, but there's just that way to where it's like showing the perception of guilt through this child's mind, and it just somehow all makes sense. So we do, much like that, we do get more of a sense of Pip, I think, in the opening scenes like we did with Oliver than we do going on when he's played by John Mills. And yeah, it's an age-old criticism, but I mean, it's hard to talk about this movie without bringing it up. The fact that John Mills was like pushing 40 when he was supposed to be playing like 20, and you can tell, you really can tell. Not in the way you couldn't see Ron Moody in his 40s playing somebody who's supposed to be like 60 or something, or late 50s or something. But here it is like, I think it doesn't help also that the transition between seeing him as a child and then as an adult, it's like if there was like another sort, like if we saw like his teenage years in between that, or like his late teenage years between that, maybe, but then again it would still be like, one day he's a teenager, the next day he's John Mills. It just doesn't. This was, yeah, it's really hard to make it work. But even so, there are definitely moments like when he's first getting there, just before he re-meets Pocket, and he's walking through, and he's kind of lost in London, and he does have this like lost sort of youthful look about him when he's trying to see where he's going and stuff like that. But yeah, then obviously for the most part, he does often take a back seat for what else this movie has in store, whether it be visually or character-wise or whatever. Story development, which we all kind of know going in anyway. But even so, it still works well on the screen just as much. Now, one of the things you do want to talk about also is something that I actually talked about recently, because I mentioned this when I talked about Sunset Boulevard like a month or two ago. And that is the fact that it's actually, to my understanding, that the elements of this in Sunset Boulevard were actually like Wilder actually took inspiration from Lean in his adaptation of this, but it's very much has the feel of a horror movie in some cases, and not just like the foggy cemetery, but obviously Miss Havisham has a lot to do with this as well, to where it's what I really love about her story is that, like, just in general, it sounds like a ghost story, where we have this woman who was basically abandoned just before she was about to get married, so she just stays in this room, still in the wedding dress, still with the food on the table as the rats eat it, and she just sits in darkness and wallows in, like, revenge. And it's like, it sounds so much like a ghost story just by itself. Not to mention how they were able to make it look. I think also the clocks that stopped like right when it happened. Like, there's just something so incredibly like otherworldly and ghostly about this, and creepy, that Lean's able to really play up in that way, that the tone has already been set by the opening scenes. And so I think there's actually like a theory that this movie created the jump scare when he first sees Magwitch in the cemetery and he like grabs him, which is a really interesting thought, of all things, to originate that, should that be the case. I don't know if there's any proof to that whatsoever, but yeah, I think there's actually a legitimate site that kind of takes like cliches and tries to find the very first original one that did it, but I don't know for sure exactly, but it definitely feels like it's at the very beginning of that, so you can't take that. But then there's also the way he's able to take it, like when Magwitch reappears. And it's like, yeah, I guess you could say it's a ghost from his past, but also when he appears, also like a ghost, he's got like, just the way he's dressed and the way he's got the eye patch, and he obviously, even from the beginning, he just had this sinister way about him, but also with the way it's raining and like the thunder's hitting and stuff like that, it just feels very much like suddenly he stepped back into the horror movie that this started in after he went through the whole becoming a gentleman thing when Magwitch reappears, which is really cool. And Lean actually did go into this territory. Blythe Spirit was, I want to say, the same year, maybe, with Rex Harrison, where he had kind of explored this ghostly territory before, only literally. But the thing about it is, and that movie is really good and really well done, but it's also in color, which sort of, has its own appearance to it, for sure, which is great. Color movies of the 40s, like that, and like Black Narcissus, are just incredible to look at. But in regards to doing that kind of thing, I think the black and white just does so much in favor for that, that there's really kind of no match to it the way it's shown here, and the way he visits that territory here. That was also sort of like a black comedy, whereas this is like, feels totally serious in these particular elements, so, but yeah, the black and white just really does wonders for that kind of thing, too, and setting that kind of tone. And so, yeah, and we do have all the characters, we do have, like, one of the characters that stands out, obviously, is this person that's just called Aged P, that only has, like, one scene. But he's kind of like the pinnacle, like, later on when you would talk about, like, the Coen Brothers movies and how there'd be, like, these one or two individual characters that have nothing to do with anything, but their personalities, and these, even if they're just one scene and, like, really brief, you just remember them, and that enriches the story in itself. It's like sometimes characters just don't need a purpose if they set the world enough. And Dickens was like one of the like masters of this. Just those characters that could just come in and out, but we would somehow still even remember their names, um, which is just yeah. And this was one of those great things also. So um, as far as as I was saying, this was basically the jumping off point for not just for Lean to kind of go in different directions, but also he kind of started this whole sort of. He had started having this penchant for social commentary in the movies that he did, pretty much after this and forward. With like, obviously he did his own version of Oliver Twist like 2 years later, and then pretty much everything up until like Hobson's Choice with Charles Lawton, which I think was 54. He sort of went on this whole social commentary kick before he ended up doing all the epics that he's known for now. Um, and so that's worth noting. I don't really have much to add to that, but that's basically. It felt like this movie was kind of the jumping off point for him to start doing that before and taking on kind of that bit of style before going on to that. And of course, there are other people that have tried bringing the story to life. Two notable directors. In like '98, we had Alfonso Cuarón try with Ethan Hawke, Gwyneth Paltrow, and De Niro, and that seems like a totally winning combination. It's like Ethan Hawke is Pip, De Niro is Magwitch, and Cuarón directing. And that's I think Anne Bancroft was who was she? Was she Harrison? Was she not? I remember her being there, but I don't remember what she. I don't know. That movie is so vague to me now because that's the point I'm getting at, is that this movie goes right into your mind the first time you've seen it, and no matter how long ago that was, it stays there like forever. And you can get a director like as talented as Cuarón with a really talented cast. And I do kind of like what he did with the Mansion. Was sort of memorable, but that's about it, really. Um, so even a director of that stature can't really pull it off in a memorable way. And then Mike Newell tried in like 2012 with Helena Bonham Carter as Havisham and Ray Fiennes played Magwitch, which once again, winning cast, a director that's done notable things, but it just went right in and right out, just nothing. So there is hardly any sort of thing that comes back to tells it the way that this did. So that's it's like it's hardly worth trying. I'm always for people trying to do other adaptations to see what other big ways they can tell it, but there's no going beyond this. I really don't think there is. So and it got a few Oscar nominations for picture, director, and screenplay. It won exactly where it should have, cinematography and production design. Somewhere else it probably should have won. I went on this whole thing about how I can see why Carol Reed beat Kubrick for 2001. I don't know that I can make that same defense for Kazan for Gentleman's Agreement, who won. The Great Expectations was also up. It's just really, because I was talking about this, but it's definitely more arguable, because I think Gentleman's Agreement won picture and director based more on like, that was a movie where I could say it won more for its subject matter than for the execution, and Great Expectations is like all 100% absolutely finely cut execution. And so, yeah, and it's widely considered like one of the best British movies ever made, and maybe any movie. So obviously I'm on board with Great Expectations more than Oliver, but I mean, as far as adaptations go, they both do their thing in their own different ways, and Oliver certainly does what it does very, very well for many different reasons, but I mean, like I said, Oliver may just come and go, like, in your mind. To some people, I can see it standing the test of time, for sure, but not even close to the way that David Lean's Great Expectations does, so there's hardly equating anything else to it, so that's where I want to leave that. So, we've got one more for this lineup, and yeah, we're gonna after the whole My Fair Lady thing, we're finally gonna visit Julie Andrews. So, and yeah, and we know all the other stuff coming up. We got the whole big MCU thing with my brother coming, and then all that other stuff. So, yeah, until all that stuff, I think that's it for